This episode is brought to you in partnership with the Mighty Arrow Family Foundation. To whom much is given, much is expected. This value guides the philosophy behind the Mighty Arrow Family Foundation today. Committed to its cause and infused with the entrepreneurial spirit, Mighty Arrow aims to invest in solutions that take action on climate change to build a more vibrant future, repair relationships from farm to market to table, heal our connection to the lands and waters we call home, and demand a more just and equitable society. To learn more about Mighty Arrow's forward-thinking, optimistic, and visionary work here in the American West and beyond, please visit www.mightyarrow.org. This is the Mountain and Prairie Podcast. I'm Ed Robertson. My guest today is Beatriz Soto. Beatriz is the Director of Protégete, a statewide program from Conservation Colorado, whose mission is to elevate Latino-driven solutions to protect our lands, water, air, and fight for environmental and climate justice. Prior to joining Conservation Colorado, she held a number of leadership and founding positions with conservation-focused organizations here in Colorado. At her core, Beatriz is a gifted and highly effective leader, one who combines her professional expertise with her unique personal story to act as a cultural bridge and give voices to both underrepresented communities and the threatened lands and waters of the West. Beatriz is originally from Chihuahua, Mexico, and she spent her childhood and youth in a bicultural setting between Mexico and the United States. She graduated from Colorado's Basalt High School, then went on to study architecture back in Chihuahua City. For nearly 20 years, she applied her talents in architecture and design to a wide range of projects, from net zero affordable housing projects to high-performance strawbale homes and everything in between, in locations ranging from the Pacific coast of Mexico to Colorado's Roaring Fork Valley. But as you'll hear in the conversation, she eventually realized that she wanted to work more directly on issues including conservation and community vitality, so she pivoted and began her new career as a conservation leader in Colorado. Beatriz and I connected virtually and had an inspirational and instructive conversation about her amazing life story and her present-day conservation work. We talked about her bicultural upbringing between Mexico and the U.S. and the realities of growing up as an undocumented child. We discussed her family's emphasis on service and community and how those values have expressed themselves throughout her career. We talk about the uncertainty that accompanied her transition from a career in architecture to a career in conservation and advocacy, and why she decided to apply her talents to the mission of Conservation Colorado. We discussed the mind-boggling process of becoming an American citizen, how she builds trust with community stakeholders, her favorite books, and much more. Be sure to check out the episode notes for a full list of everything we covered. A huge thank you to Beatriz for taking the time to share her wisdom, and thank you so much for listening. Hope you enjoy. All right, Beatriz, thank you so much for taking the time. As I was preparing for this interview and after we talked a few weeks ago, I've really been digging into all the stuff that you have done and are currently doing. And it's mind-blowing how you get it all done. And so thank you for taking the time to chat. I'm super excited. I was wondering if we could just start at the very beginning, because your life story and your trajectory through life is so interesting and inspiring and educational. And I was wondering if we could just start at the beginning. Where were you born? What was your family like? Talk about your childhood a bit.
Yeah, absolutely. And I feel like this question is really welcoming in this moment, as I've been, we all go through stages of our lives where we revisit our own story and we imagine how we share it and how we tell it. I'm originally from Chihuahua, Mexico, and I grew up between the United States and Mexico and the majority of my life as the daughter of undocumented immigrants and growing up undocumented myself. And I really like to think about my upbringing kind of similar, to monarch butterfly or a turkey vulture, may it be, wolf or a jaguar, species that have to travel long distances to meet their needs. And, that you have to sometimes push boundaries, right, to be able to survive and to be able to thrive. And sometimes that's across political boundaries and it's across culture and language. And it brings us to this journey, right, of being this child that grew up between two very different places, different ecosystems, different peoples, and with the particularity of being undocumented while you do this travel.
Could you talk about what initially brought you to the U.S. for the first time? Like, what brought your parents there and you along with them?
Yeah, so I've been, again, I've been reflecting a lot on my own identity and my parents and how they've been shaping me. And my father's family particularly, they were pretty mobile between different parts of Mexico and always lived close to the border. And may it be in Baja California and the border with California, or Chihuahua and the border with Texas and New Mexico. And just there was always a lot of fluidity between those two like border spaces. So my father, since a very young age, he was able to go and work temporarily in the United States. And so did my grandfather. So this is, a story long before I was even born. They were already making those connections between these two nations and working on either side of the border based on economics, where they were at that time and moment. So my father started that journey since he was a kid. And then eventually, when he had his own kids, my first journey to the United States was when I was 2 with my parents and now my mother as well. And, we had the opportunity to live in Texas and Florida and Colorado. And, it's movement with work opportunities, really, right? And depending on different circumstances and different recessions that the country has been through and that Mexico has been through as well. And that has really shaped their mobility and where they've been in different times of our life. But yeah, it started when I was 2. So I would say migrating back and forth, and my migration story starts even before I was born, and then it becomes really, really acute once I'm a child.
And so, I mean, it's a very broad question, but yeah, I've got you were talking about, moving at 2 and then, kind of moving as a young kid. And I have 2 daughters right now. One is almost 9 and one is 6. And I just think about how they're so, I guess, kind of malleable and they can kind of go with the flow in a way that I noticed that I'm not able to as I've gotten older and kind of set my ways. And it seems that a lot of times, whatever the situation is, they seem to be able to kind of adjust to it. And so how was that as a young girl moving from one place to another? Did you find it that you were able to adjust to the new places pretty easily, or was it challenging for you? Or like when you've been in this process of reflecting back, do you think of it in a positive light, or how do you think about it?
I actually really do think about it in a positive light. And I really appreciate this question because I've even been thinking about it for my own son. He's 13 now, and I feel this ability to adapt, to move, to trust your intuition, to trust your ability, to be resilient, to be able to adapt to different social norms and cultures has been such an amazing tool for me throughout my life, that having that mobility when I was young really was able to give me that. I don't know. It's a tool, right? Be
Sure.
able to do that. And I think you're absolutely right. When you're a child, you can't tell as much, and our ability to adapt and to learn is just so, you're curious and you're adaptable and you can shapeshift, I would almost call it, in such a different way than when we're adults. And then, so I think that's been a tremendous, asset in my life. And the times when I remember that I really noticed that I was in a different culture, or that, I could really like pinpoint it, I don't think it was until I was 9 and my parents sent me to Mexico from Florida. And it was very shocking because I thought of Mexico at that point, watching cartoons in the United States and like Speedy Gonzalez and like how Mexico is portrayed in, American television. I thought I was going to go to this ranch with old cars and that you were going to see these like hay, balls running through the abandoned road. And and I get there and I'm like, wow, this is a city. And, it was just, it just really like those myths of Mexico started to like fall apart. And I was able to like truly see it and truly experience the progress of the Mexican culture and be in cities and different spaces. And, that I think that's the first time that I don't want to say a lie, but how cultures are portrayed that fell down, inside my imagination. It's like, oh, I was told this isn't real. I'm seeing reality right now and it's different than what I was taught. And that was a very stark moment. And I was around 9 when I experienced that because I hadn't gone back to Mexico since I was 2.
Was there any of the reverse of looking back at the U.S.? And so you knew the U.S. I mean, for most of your memories, I would guess, was the U.S. And then all of a sudden you're looking at the U.S. from the outside in. Did it give you a different perspective on either how the U.S. is thought about by folks in Mexico or you may have been a little too young, but did it change your, I guess, the kind of foundational ideas you had about the U.S. looking back in?
I think that shift and that change came for me at an older age. When I was in high school, we had already moved to Mexico and we came back. And that's when I first moved back to the Roaring Fork Valley. And from my childhood memories and from my memories in Mexico, I always saw just how, the abundance of the US. And I always really thought of the US as like this land of, great possibilities and access to so many privileges because I was young and I hadn't realized how much my parents struggled living in the US and documented. So when I come back, I'm 17 and I want to go to college and, I start to feel, that I can start to see the limiting opportunities that I really had by being undocumented. And then I start to, with this newer consciousness of a 17-year-old, I can see, poverty. I can see oppression. I can start to see, the reality of my reality and the reality of the kids that look like me that are from immigrant families. I can really start to understand at a deeper level that this bubble of maybe it's like fantasy, I would say, of the US, I start to see gaps in it, right? And I start to see it more as it really is. And then I start to understand it at a different level where when I was a child and my memories of growing up in the US, again, just abundance and wealth and a lot of opportunity, obviously because I was a child and I was protected by my parents and their efforts, right, to make sure that we had a good life. But I didn't understand how hard it was for them until I was older and I was able to have those conversations. So I think that's when I realized it, but that's not until I came back and really lived it.
I would guess also in your teenage years, the idea of being undocumented probably solidified more in your mind. How can you talk about that experience and how, being aware that you're undocumented, how did that affect your life on a daily basis? I mean, was it kind of a background source of stress or source of frustration or all the above? I'd love to just hear your experience with that.
Well, citizenship is it's political, right? In many systems in the US, we know it's broken. And to live that, I mean, for me in an everyday life was a hard journey. There's, millions of people in the US living under these circumstances every single day. And they have been for decades, including my own parents and a lot of my extended family. I think it's unique to every person. There's obviously the collective story of the struggles that we collectively push for and that we collectively experience. such as lack of opportunities to scholarships, to go to school, lack of opportunities to move up in our professional careers that we can experience collectively. For me, at a very individual level, I always thought and reflected on myself, and I would ask myself the question, what would I want to achieve if I were documented? And I would say, oh, I would like to have this job. I would like to aspire to certain things. So I pushed as hard as I could to meet some of my dreams and my personal goals. And, there was a point where I realized that I reached what I was able to achieve under that political reality of being undocumented. And I was very proud of myself because, I achieved quite a bit under that status, but I was also I had my feet on the ground, and I was very realistic that this was as far as I was going to be able to go. And that's when, I started to question myself and figure if this was, being in that situation was my purpose and where I could, do the most out of my life and achieve a lot of dreams and goals that I had. And, it's been a complicated journey, and it's been a lot of struggle and, a lot of really deep asking of belonging and identity and, who are you? Are you the undocumented immigrant? Are you Mexican? Are you American? You belong somewhere in the middle and in this gray zone that's not clearly defined. But I think that, it's a story of resilience, right? As many migrants to really figure that out and embrace that it's not a binary, and embrace the gray space and the in-betweens, and, see ourselves as bridges and start to think about, what is our role and our purpose growing up in this particular, situation, and what can we provide to the greater good, highlighting, the cracks in the system that
Sure.
allow this reality for millions of people, and how can we solve it?
Well, that brings me to another question. You strike me in our conversation a few weeks ago, and then in my research, you strike me as this really amazing mix of humility plus very, very focused, very hardworking, ambitious in the best sense of the word, and a lot of everything you seem to do goes through this lens. You just mentioned a second ago of trying to make the world a little bit better, and so where did that come from? I mean, where I would imagine you gained a lot of your work ethic from observing your parents and your family, but where did this idea of working towards the greater good come from? Because you could have just as easily been laser focused on, I want to be the greatest investment banker at Goldman Sachs, but instead you want to use your skills and your talent and your brain and your hard work to make the world better. Did you have mentors, role models? Where did that come from?
That I think that commitment to service definitely comes from my family. Recently, my mom shared this story that kind of shined a light on, their reality. And she shared that when she was younger and we were growing up and we were in Florida again, they worked so hard. And she would drop us off at school and she would see the PTA moms. And she always had a dream to be, a PTA mom and be able to help shape the school that we were in. And I was like, Mom, that's so cute that you shared that, right? That, you really wanted to be of service for the school, and you didn't have the opportunity to do that. So, I think those kitchen table conversations, even being undocumented, were very political. They were very focused on systems and how systems weren't working. My parents were always, I remember them having conversations of the earthquake that happened in Mexico City. I think it was in the 80s, and being really concerned and sending money. And then in my house, we always had people staying over because they were migrating, they were in transition, and there was always a place at our table and at our home. And, to really be able to survive as an undocumented person in this country, you need a network of support of people that have gone through that experience and that you help each other, right? And because, when you're in that space, you can't access government programs. You can't access, the traditional systems of help. So then community builds their own systems of help. And I think with COVID and with wildfires and other climate catastrophes and, pandemics and things that happen in society, you start to see those networks like really get into action and support each other. So I think it's all connected to that. And then again, I think some of my mentors are, leaders in these spaces and that have really been able to, hold their communities whole and support their families. And yeah, I would say I've witnessed that since I was, a young child. And then, in community, there's a lot of, really amazing people that really hold this concept very dear. In the Latino community, we really strive to be a service leader. So it's like you're always asking yourself, and I think it goes back to our indigenous roots, how can I be of service? What does it mean to be of service? And there's this reciprocity, right? When you are of service, abundance and the care of community comes with that. And it's another type of abundance, another type of care. When you are of service, you are taken care of as well because community holds each other and there's this interdependence. So I would say, those models were very visible to me as a child, and they have been throughout my life, and I really see them. And I like to see those patterns in community and how we help each other. So I really try to lean into that and hold that dear to my heart.
I really feel like community is a human need, just like healthy food, like water, like exercise. I mean, I think as individual humans, we're kind of silly little animals, but really the only chance we have had for however many millions of years of our evolution is working together. And it seems like now society is set up in a way that communities are disappearing. And, if left to my own devices, I could definitely probably hole up in my house and not talk to anybody. But I know I've come to the realization that that's not good. And it kind of goes against what we're built to do as a species. Do you agree with that? That community is just, it's part of who we are as a species?
Absolutely. There is no way, we can, as a species, I would say we're pretty fragile.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
And, I wish I was, as resilient and strong as like moss or like, that's not the reality, right? We are incredibly fragile species. And, I think going to that conversation of community, I mean, obviously our human community is incredibly important for our ability to thrive. And then from there, it's also our non-human community, right? Which is ecosystems and the land and being in right relationship with, and that is our extended community, right? So I think this concept of community is so expansive and is you are absolutely correct. There is no way, any single one of us, is able to get to where we are at any point without the support and the interdependence of others. And now in this reality too, is that we're a global community, right? So then how do we even think of at ourselves at that scale? But we are incredibly interconnected and interdependent with each other. And community is absolutely, the strongest tool that we have for our resilience.
So when you went to college, what were the goals? Because you've had this amazing career in the design world. I mean, was that your number one focus, or what were you thinking maybe as you were in college and then as you got out, entered the world as an adult on your own? What were the goals and plans at that point?
Yeah. So, I've always, since I was a young girl, I was very inquisitive. I love to see patterns and systems. I was, in family dynamics and community. And as I mentioned, my parents they worked in the construction industry. So going into school, I really wanted to be, a sculptor and like on the creative side and maybe study art and designing and creating. But that was not a reality for me. I came from a low income family and art is just like, it's not a thing you do.
Yeah.
So you being very pragmatic and practical as I am, I'm like, architecture seems like a good fit, right? I can get a job, I can get a good salary, I'm good at math and physics, and it seems like a place where I can also apply my artistic self to and some of my desire for art and design. So I leaned into that and it was a good journey. I was able to go to a school in Mexico where you're going to laugh at this, but I paid $40 a semester.
Oh my
It was
gosh.
so affordable because
That's
it's a
so
federal
great.
school. And, that was the way I was able to be a working student at that young age and really pay for my own college because my mom wasn't really able to do that at that time. And it was a great experience, fascinating. I love the world of architecture and, being able to manipulate and design our environment and our cities and our spaces. And it can have a really big impact on our culture and our society. So it was a fascinating period of my life for sure.
And can you talk a bit about, when you were working in the design world in the Roaring Fork Valley, and when we spoke a few weeks ago, we were talking about this kind of transition evolution you had in your mind of starting to look at that work a little bit differently, the longer you did it. And could you just talk about that part of your career?
Yeah. So as you mentioned, I was working in the Roaring Fork Valley where, I'm very privileged to have the opportunity to connect with nature pretty frequently. And, I've been on this journey of being out in nature and walking and almost getting into like deep meditative states when I'm in nature. And on, one of those occasions that I was trail running, I believe at the time, and I was starting to have some real, big conflict around some of the projects that I was, participating in because I was doing green design, high performance building, sustainability, and, which are amazing projects, but the clientele of this area, they say around here that the billionaires are kicking out the millionaires. So these are, second, third homes. They're incredibly large. A lot of times, people don't really live in them for long periods of time. And yeah, we were putting some of the best technology in them, right? They had amazing insulation in the walls and the roof and the foundations. They had geothermal systems, large PV panel arrays. But, I would ask the question, is building a second or third home, even if it has the most advanced technology, is that still sustainable? I wanted to go deeper, right? I wanted to get to like the root cause of some of our, climate issues. And as my understanding of the climate crisis, I started to develop more awareness around it. I was asking that question, should we continue to develop at this scale? Do people really need two homes? Shouldn't we start to scale back? Shouldn't we stop building as much, especially luxury? What is not essential, right? And this was 10 years ago. And I was asking myself these questions. And, as you can imagine, saying this to a client or saying this to my boss was probably not the best conversation, and it wasn't going in the right direction because, I wanted to say, we shouldn't be doing this. Let's stop and let's question, right? And I wanted to ask, some of our clients, do you really need two sets of washers and dryers? Do you really need, a kitchen that is this size? Do you really need, wood that is coming from Brazil or from some Chinese ministry and that they reclaim the wood that's exotic. And I was like realizing where all these products were coming from. And really a lot of the purpose of some of these homes were to show off their wealth.
Oh yeah.
To their friends. Right. And I was seeing this in real time. And then I would go home to a mobile home, and I would go home to my community and see how some of us were living. And there's dignity in that too. It's not the most high performing building. They're small, they're dense, they're sometimes the bare minimum. And I'm like, I am content with this. I have my needs met. Why are we designing and creating these structures that are like castles that take up so much, that have so much embodied energy, that their carbon emissions and their footprint is so grand? And it was almost like I had this cognitive dissonance, right? And I couldn't make sense of it. And I was just really struggling. And that's when, in my walks in nature and in my connection to the land, I really felt like the land spoke to me and said to me, you need to move. You need to shift your direction. You need to start doing something different, because it was breaking my heart. And I was becoming, sarcastic and bitter. And I couldn't tap into like my energy source. I couldn't tap into my imagination, my creativity, because to my core, I knew I was doing something that was against my values, and that's not the path forward. And I'm like, I'm not going to pretend that I am okay with this. And I need to maybe remove myself from that space. That's where I can start, and to start to invest in another space without, again, being sarcastic and being, the person that's always criticizing and not happy with the projects, and recognizing that it was my time to shift.
I love hearing that. And in a lot of ways, it parallels some of my career experiences, because I was in a similar type of world, dealing with similar type of clientele, selling these, mega ranches all over the West. And everything you said, I had similar thoughts, and it was, I don't know, it was very challenging though for me. And I'd love to hear about like how you actually made the transition out, because I think there's, it all makes perfect sense, but then there's this reality of, all right, I've got a steady job here. I'm making money. I've established my reputation. The idea of kind of starting over or taking a bit of a hard turn into a new career can, at least for me, I can only speak for myself, it was very unsettling in a lot of ways. And so like, can you talk about that actual transition when you actually decided, all right, I'm going to be done with this, and I'm going to apply my skills to something that I can feel real good about?
I mean, I think unsettling is such a good word for this. I was scared. I mean, to be completely honest with you. And
me too. I was trying to act like a tough guy when I...
Oh my God. And I was like, I personally, I went through a crisis, to be completely frank, because I was like, I was the first of all my, extended family to go to college, and my cousins and stuff. Right. And then, my mom was so proud of me for, getting myself through college. And I just felt like, I was meeting my family's expectations. And then all of a sudden, I have what, many might consider, a pretty successful life. And I was like, how can I leave this? And am I going to be a disappointment for my family because I'm not happy here? So I think there was a lot of that, like really taking over my emotional state. And, at some point I made a leap of faith, and I joined the Wilderness Workshop, which is a local conservation nonprofit, as a community organizer. I had never done public lands conservation work. I knew I loved nature. I knew I loved mountains that surround me. I knew that this was probably a better path that aligned with my values, but it was a leap of faith, because you can imagine, from being a professional, architect to being a community organizer, it almost feels like a step backwards. So that was very nerve-wracking. And, for a little while, I had to do a little bit of consulting on different things and holding different projects and working with different organizations. So, I did the best that I could to do that leap and be able to feel like I can make it work, but it wasn't easy. And then I took on little designs here and there for close friends that would help me pay for this transition. And then I also have to name, at that point in my life, I was living in affordable housing that I was able to get into many years, prior. And God bless affordable housing, right? Because sometimes, unless you have housing stability and at least your minimum needs met, it gives you the opportunity to take risks.
Yes.
It gives you the opportunity to have mobility and to, do, what aligns with your values, to test, yourself, to be able to go to your growing edges, knowing that you have that stability. And at that point, I was also a resident, right? I hadn't become an American citizen, but I was already legal in the country. So there was like a whole bunch of factors that I think, the stars aligned for me, that when I was having this crisis of wanting to transition to work that aligned more with my values, I had, several things in my life that were allowing me to take that jump. So I also think it's very important to name that, because otherwise you're limited, right? To be able to do some of these jumps. But it was a very scary jump. And now that I look back and reflect, it's the best thing I ever did with my life.
How long did it take you to feel like, okay, this was the right move? Like, were there any points maybe like in the first 6 months or whatever, where you're like, oh no, I may have made a mistake here? Or was it pretty quickly you realized you enjoyed what you're doing, it had great purpose, and you're really, really good at it?
I think I'm still there, Ed. I'm happy where I'm at, and I still, I'll listen to a design podcast. I'll see some amazing architects that are doing, 3D printing with mud. And I'll feel a little bit of like that, like yearning, and that little bit of like, oh, I missed that, or am I ever going to go back? So I think I'm still processing it, and I'm still trying to figure out how I'm going to connect everything that I am and that I love into one particular job or lifestyle, I would say, maybe. So
I feel like you never figured out, and it's only when you look backwards and you see how it all connects, you're like, oh yeah, that makes perfect sense. But because that's how I am right now. I'm like, what the world am I doing? How does that, I mean, if things had gone according to plan A for me, I'd be a stockbroker. And then I'd be a real estate developer. And then now I'm a conservation person with a podcast. Like, it doesn't, but looking back, it adds up. But I don't know. I'm glad to hear that. I'm glad to hear. Yeah, it is a journey, but it's good. It's really good for people who are listening to this, because they could read your bio and see all the amazing stuff you put out in the world and the impact you're having, and just think, oh, she's got it all figured out. But I think that's very, very instructive for people to understand that you're still figuring it out, and you probably always will be. Be kind of boring otherwise, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's human nature for us to be satisfied and have dignity, to be able to grow and to be able to expand and grow into the possibilities of our genius, right? All of us have genius, and otherwise we wouldn't be humans. And I think, part of having a dignified life is being able to expand to your own limits and to dismantle some of your old beliefs and create new value systems, and to be resilient and adapt and to be able to flourish.
I think I see a book in your future. You need to write all this down. And then you come back on and we'll promote it and sell lots of copies. Because that's very, 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 that's very wise stuff put in a way that even somebody like me can understand. Thank you. When did Conservation Colorado come into your view as a potential place to take your skills?
So I first encountered Conservation Colorado when in 2020, I ran for county commissioner of Garfield County, which is where I live. I had never in my life thought that I would run for elected office. And that's when the pandemic hit all of us, right? And that just came into the world. And it really started to show, how systems were really failing different communities and how they were failing them disproportionately. And I decided to run for office because 70% of the COVID cases in my community were in the Latino community when we're just 30% of the population.
Wow.
And Conservation Colorado endorsed me, and I went through an interview process because they're a political nonprofit. So we have the C4 and the C3 kind of mechanism. And I was one of their endorsed candidates. And I didn't win. I didn't win that race. I lost by 500 votes, but I was able to establish this relationship with this great organization, and they invited me to apply for a director position leading their Latino specific body of work. And I saw that they were, we were values aligned and that they were committed to environmental justice and equity and inclusion. And I appreciated that they weren't only doing like purely public land conservation and land conservation, but they worked in that realm. They worked on climate from the built environment, transportation, housing. They also worked in water conservation and then environmental justice. And then they were able to tie all of this into the political as well as the environmental and the community. So it just felt like the right home for me at that time and moment. And, it's been one of the honors of my life to be able to, see all the policy making, how we endorse with elected officials, to see how we bring in community to, the policy making. This past year, we were able to pass a water testing program for people that live in mobile home parks, because we had been hearing for decades, that people in mobile home parks that, believe it or not, they live pretty close to resort communities, right? But these are the little pockets, right? These are the little pockets where systems tend to fail. And we were hearing from communities that the water that came out of their faucets was staining their clothes, that they were having health issues, their hair was falling out, or reactions on their skin. And, we were able to, work with these communities and, starting a testing program is the first step, right? That hasn't solved the issue, but making sure that we are thinking about communities when we're creating policy and change. I mean, that for me is just, it's exciting, right? It really is like values aligned, and it really makes you feel like you're making a difference in the world. So it's been a really great experience to be able to collaborate in organizations that are really like connecting lands, environment, climate, people, and working like at a larger unsiloed space. So that's a little bit of what we do and the excitement of working for Conservation Colorado.
And so can you just talk a bit about your day-to-day or month-to-month work, kind of the types of, I mean, that water testing thing, I mean, that's such direct impact. I mean, I don't think you can get more direct than that. What a amazing deal and such a great victory. But like, can you talk more about exactly your role within the organization and the projects you manage?
Yeah, so I lead Protégete, and that is our Latino initiative within the organization. And the work that I particularly and my team lead is we do leadership development. And that is, with the vision of diversifying the environmental space to better reflect the community that we serve. So we train community leaders to really understand environmental justice, climate justice, and how through policy we can change the reality of communities and our future resilience and, cutting carbon emissions, all of that, but really training people on the ground to be leaders in that space. And then we have a boards and commission fellowship where, you have city boards, state boards, there's some federal boards as well, where we want to start to see more diversity in those spaces and community voices that represent disproportionately impacted communities. So when those, decision-making bodies are implementing or creating policies, that we have more diverse voices at the table to help create stronger policies that can meet the needs of more people, and that we're not, creating policies out of assumptions because those voices aren't at the table. So that's a lot of the body of work that we do. And then we've also, been working really closely with the policymakers to make sure that we pass policies like the clean water in mobile home parks, that we have stronger regulations to protect the community. So we work pretty closely with policymakers and then with community. And then also on the political side, we work, with our political team to make sure that candidates that are running for office that are environmental champions or want to be environmental champions are also thinking of, how am I going to bring in the Latino community? How am I going to make sure? And we want to make sure that they're stakeholding this community, that they understand the issues that they're facing, and that, our elected officials are also doing their part in, having a strong democracy. And, we're doing our part as well in making sure that more people are participating. And, democracy is one of the biggest tools that we have in our country to make change. And we really want to make sure that people are bought into this idea of civic engagement and being of service. And because civic engagement is so much more than voting. Like, voting is one part of civic engagement, but there's so much more that we can all do. I mean, if we have the time and the ability to be on our local planning and zoning committee, we can make so much change. We can participate, we can collaborate. If we are participating in our climate action plans, right? If we are participating with our fire district, we can start to think about what are emergency response plans that don't leave Spanish speaking people with disabilities behind, and that we are serving, and that we are creating systems that will not leave people behind, but we must participate. So that's where we really feel like we add to the ecosystem, is how do we train and how do we build networks of people that can really participate in these decision-making spaces so we're not left behind.
When I was in the conservation world full time, a lot of my work was around water issues and particularly irrigated farmland and how, buy and dry, where these municipalities would sell off big portions of their water portfolio. And a lot of times the irrigated farmland or farmers would sell to municipalities, and then the irrigated farmland would get dried up. And so there was a lot of talking with county commissioners and different folks in the elected officials in both cities and counties. And part of it was very inspiring to me just because of what you said, the amount of people that you could see out at these meetings participating and really helping to shape the future. But one thing, and so that was very inspiring. And then on the flip side, I would go and talk with different county commissioners or different elected officials, and the majority were productive and pleasant. But every now and then, I'd talk with somebody whose interests were not really aligned with what I was doing, and it was just you could tell nothing much was going to come of it. And so I'm curious, when you approach different stakeholders, different leaders, officials, hopeful officials that may be running for office, how are you and your efforts, how are they met? I mean, are they happy to hear from you? Are they open to learning, or is it kind of a mixed bag?
Yeah, I would say it's a mixed bag. We have a lot of people that really want to work with us, and they want to do what's right, and their heart's in the right place. And then, we encounter people that really don't care.
Yeah.
Or like you mentioned, right? They have their self-interest. Or the other thing that I find, too, is that a lot of times what I've seen is that people overcommit to too many people.
Yes.
And
yes.
too many interests. And sometimes those are conflicting, right? So I think as, these elected officials, go into office, your values have to be really strong, and you have to commit to why you're serving there. And when you're there to please everybody, that's really hard. That's a really tough position to be in. And so I think, and that's why, political campaigns, and you should be really honest about what you want to do and what you're going to stand for, so people can expect that from you. So yeah, anyway, it's so complicated, right? And it goes on a case by case basis. And, I would say a lot of times there's we lose, right? We're not always winning. I'm not going to state like, there are wins and we celebrate them and they're amazing. And there's also sometimes it feels like we're going backwards or we're not getting much done. And so much of this work too is like, it's the whole process. You have to like elect the right person and then get the right policy passed, and not just that one individual is going to create the policy, right? That's the whole chamber and the whole legislature makes that. And then the governor approves it. And then it goes into an agency and then it's implemented through rulemaking, and it goes through a whole another iteration of changes and stakeholders. So even this one initial idea that sometimes can seem fantastic has to go through all these layers of people and changes, and it gets manipulated. And sometimes at the end of it, you don't even recognize it.
Yeah.
So it's a process, and sometimes it's very uplifting, and there's a lot of hope. And sometimes we're like, okay, well, 5 more years, let's keep trying, right? This is going to take us a decade. This is going to take us, 5 years to get to the point where the vision that we see. And I think it's just a matter of, being steadfast and having hope and being diligent and hard work and not giving up, right, on what we believe or what I believe and the values that is the right thing to do for the collective well-being, right, and for our future. And it can be tricky and hard sometimes.
You strike me, even though we're not like best friends in the world, you strike me as that you may get a little bit of energy from, like if somebody tells you no, that might give you the energy to, you might actually kind of like it. Because you strike me as somebody who's not going to take no as an answer.
Well, I always, come back to, my upbringing, my family. I have a 13-year-old little boy. And when we lose on climate stuff and policy and, policy that we have sound science behind it, do we even have an option to say no?
That's right.
We don't, right? We have to keep pushing, and sometimes we see a lot of like news around the biodiversity loss, right? Of how much species we're losing and how like, we're sometimes not meeting our carbon emissions that we should be reducing. And I think, seeing that it has like this little bit of hurt and this little bit of like eco grief and climate anxiety. But then it's also like, am I just going to sit here and be anxious or am I going to, really go out there and try my best so I can, look back and tell my son, I did the darn best that I could. And a lot of us did. And this is a collective effort. And I think if we all really commit to that, like, future where, we continue to have this beautiful planet, we continue to be able to, see these magnificent species, have a dignified life of their own, and that we are in balance with each other and we have a healthy economy and that we have communities that are resilient and that people can celebrate their cultures wherever they live on the globe. And we're not seeing mass migrations. And, if we can all collectively see that, right, and work towards that, I really think we have a chance. So you're right. I will not take no for an answer.
I love it. I love it. Can you talk a bit about the Colorado Latino Climate Justice Handbook? Because I studied that as I was preparing, and it's such an impressive document, and I'd love to, and I'll link to it so people who are listening can click through and see it for themselves. But can you talk a bit about where the genesis of that came, where it came from, or where the idea came from, and then kind of how that document has been used?
Yeah. So when I started this new position, what was it, 2.5 years ago, I asked myself and the organization is like, what are our priorities? Because here I am, I have to do this, the Latino, right, part of Conservation Colorado. Where is my baseline? Where's the science that I can, really center the Latino community around data points? And I kind of looked around in different parts and different resources, and there's some like federal stuff, and I was just finding a gap in the data and in the data is out there, right? There's a lot of information out there. I think what sometimes is lacking is under what filters are we processing data. So for me, it was like, if I'm, a Latina and I really want to understand what is the energy and security of my community? Our PV panels and all the investments that we've been pushing for the last decade or two and the programs for weatherization and all of that, are they serving my community? Are they reaching this community, right? Transportation, we have these carpool models, right? What is it? Car share. And I'm like, is that really serving this community? Are they really using it? What type of vehicles do we use? How do we design programs and solutions that meet community where they're at? I hear that term a lot, like meet community where they're at. And a lot of people think it's just going out and meeting community physically. And that is a part of it. I'm not going to say it's not, but it's also, looking at the reality of how people live. How much money do they make, right? What is our economic bracket? Where are we? If we are designing, programs that will help people with their climate resilience that are for a certain budget, right? And a certain income, then you're not, large swaths of society, you're not designing this program for them. You're designing this program for the, very specific group of people. And sometimes it's the wealthier, more affluent people. If we want to put a Tesla in everybody's, garage, do we have to ask ourselves, what kind of vehicles do people drive? What is their work situation? What is their economic reality? What language do they speak to be able to access this program? Do they even have a garage? Where do they have a house? Where do they live? Right. So I think, again, the information is out there. I think it's a matter of how you ask the question and then how you come up with conclusions and policy solutions that really, start to ask broader questions. And that's how this handbook came about, right? Because it was a group of Latinas, and we were asking all of these questions, and we're like, well, let's look at the data. Let's look at our state data. Let's look at our federal data, and let's look at, different point sources of information of public parks and distance, you have to travel, sidewalks, tree canopy, like all of this information. And let's tell a story that is easy to understand, that is backed by data. And let's start from there. Let's meet community where they're at. And let's start to think about policy that meets this community, and maybe policy that addresses a climate situation, but it can also maybe address poverty. Maybe it addresses, putting heat pumps in multifamily buildings, but we're also talking about tree canopy, and we're talking about sidewalks, and we're talking about access to parks, because it's not going to be one single solution that creates systemic change. It's going to be layered solutions that help address multiple problems. And that's really what we wanted to get at the root of, is like, how can we, when we think about environmental conservation policy, where should it be located? How do we stack it, right, with other types of policy? And we create more comprehensive solutions that will really create change versus little siloed solutions that are here and there. And what we saw, and it's really clearly, is the accumulation of the benefits of a lot of our historic climate policy and investments in parks and all of that are very saturated in certain areas where it's wealthier, more affluent, and it's very depleted in other areas. So now that we have, big federal investments coming in, America the Beautiful, the Inflation Reduction Act, and more, it has to be focused on the people that need it the most. Because otherwise, you're going to get migration inside our state, right?
Oh, yeah.
You're going to get displacement. You're going to get poverty, and we're going to put more pressure on cities. And it's a trickle effect, right? Everybody, it's all interconnected. So I think if we want to be honest to ourselves, we have to solve the inequities that exist in our communities through good climate and conservation policy. That is a part of the puzzle.
Well, that was one of the things I really loved about the handbook, is it's full of data, but it's also full of very, very, very powerful storytelling, even in some of the charts and graphs. Like that, there's one that I was thinking about that very clearly shows the link of how environmental policy and conservation policy, how that directly affects racial justice, gender justice, economics, health. Like you were able to put it together in a way that even on a first read, it opened my eyes to things that I've thought about a lot, but haven't really been able to connect the dots in the way that y'all connected it in that handbook. So I really encourage people to check it out, and you can download it through the link in the episode notes. But really, really great job. I mean, what's next for you? I mean, I would imagine having that complete, and I mean, I imagine you'll continue to have new additions and all that kind of stuff. But like, what are your priorities as you look towards the next year, 18 months, 2 years?
Something that I've really been dreaming about is we have these clear roadmaps and metrics around, what are the biggest sectors in our community that we need to cut down their carbon emissions, right, to meet our climate goals. There's roadmaps, right? We know what we need to do with the transportation sector. We know what we need to do with the built environment. And I feel like there's a lack of a roadmap that really clearly delineates where Colorado needs to go to be, a state that has really tackled environmental injustice. And I really hope, in the next year or two, we really have a roadmap with solutions that we can present to, the state legislature, to local governments, to our, to the governor's office, to be like, here is a roadmap that is backed by science. And, here is, a set of policies that will help us achieve environmental justice for the people of Colorado alongside our climate goals and our conservation goals. So it's this like multi-layered track of where we're heading as a society, as a state, but that has a clear delineated map to achieve environmental justice. So that's something that I'm excited for. And, this would include the tribes, people from different ethnic, economic backgrounds. And I think it's key, right, to our resilience in the face of climate change. And it's key to our economic success. And, and it's really with an intent that, we're not going to leave people behind, and that we're going to, again, be multifaceted and address all of these issues collectively. And that's exciting. That's
super exciting.
What I see in the future.
I'll be excited to watch from the sidelines, and then maybe we can talk about it again in the future. If you're not sick of talking to me, you're like, never again. Back up one thing that I'd love to hear about, kind of last big topic, but you ended up becoming a documented American. Can you talk about how that came to be? So I guess that would have been soon before you ran for office.
Yeah, you can't run for office if you're not an American citizen. It was an interesting journey. I was, I became an American citizen through marriage. So that was, finally how I was able to move forward, because I tried through the DACA path. I'm a little older than being able to apply for DACA. So that was, and I tried as well through getting sponsored through jobs. That's a very complicated path. Man, immigration policy is it's a nightmare. It is so archaic. It is so, it's not serving us. And it's way too complex. And so, yeah, that's how I was able to do it. Yeah, I got married and I got sponsored through marriage, and here I am.
It's just crazy. And I think about this on many different levels, particularly with healthcare, that how complicated it is for, somebody like me who speaks the language, even though I have this crazy Southern accent, speak the language, educated, very proactive, at some points, probably too aggressive. And it dealing with healthcare stuff is like the biggest nightmare in the world. And so then I think about people who, don't have the time or don't speak the language. And it's just the craziest thing to me. And I know that's nothing new. And, you lived it with the whole documentation thing. It's just, I don't know. I mean, how do we work our way out of that? I mean, are you optimistic that maybe it can be cleaned up in the future, or is it going to get worse? I mean, what do you think about that whole system after having been in it?
Again, it's archaic, it's old, it's not serving us. It was, really created, I think, out of a place of fear of others. Even right now, we have a crisis of needing more workforce. And that's, there's so many employers that need more workforce, and we can't even, they can't even find the right workforce. And then there's also this other problem of like dwindling of how many new people we need to be born to keep our economics. And, migrants can really help making sure that the US economy is strong. And then on top of that, I think more and more we will start to see climate displacement and migration. And I think we need to be realistic and put our humanity first to really, not make the same mistakes of the past, and be very intentional of what it looks like for the United States to be, have good, just immigration policies that really favor the American people, that really favor the migrants as well, and the right protections. And I honestly, I believe that our immigration system is the way it is because we have not let go of a lot of ideas of slavery, and we have to shed from those ideals because they're not humane. Come on, let's be honest. This addiction to low wage, workers that can be abused is not something new. We've just changed the faces of it. We changed the labels of it, and having millions of people in this country that are so vulnerable and can be abused so easily and that have no voice, that is very similar to a slave market. And we have to grapple with that. And we need to solve this, especially in the time and the moment that we are in, like right now, which is that we are in a new climate reality. And we need the right policies to come along with that reality. So, and it's a hard subject. It's a hard subject. A lot of people don't like to lean into it, but we need this, and it has to, and, and I'm really doing a call to action to, my climate and conservation friends, to be willing to participate and step out of their silos and, little areas of expertise to be broader and to think about ourselves in a more expansive way, because all of this, and like you mentioned, healthcare, housing, like all of it is interconnected, and we have to be willing to have, these conversations to create, better futures for ourselves, for our children, and set us up for success moving forward.
Yeah, well, sometimes I get so down and angry and everything, but then I get to talk to people like you, and it makes me optimistic and happy. So thank you. It's a very selfish project I have here with this podcast. I'm just trying to talk to all these cool people doing cool stuff, important stuff, and then it makes me feel better about the world. And I think everybody, so many people who listen, it's the same thing, because you can list the problems all day long. I mean, and there are plenty of, I think media outlets do that. But when we get the opportunity to talk to somebody like you that is on the ground doing this work and is obviously so smart and so hardworking and so passionate about the work, it's hard not to feel good about it, even when how, the details of how daunting things can be. Anyway, so thank you for that. 2 quick questions for you. The first one is, can you give me any book recommendations? And it could be any books. It could be about your work. It could be books that you just have read and have played a role in your development as a human. Could be just a good novel you enjoyed. But I'd love to hear any books that have meant something to you.
Yeah, well, I'm an avid reader.
Yeah, I could tell.
And I love to read all sorts of books, but something that which I'm pretty sure you've been recommended by others, is Braiding Sweetgrass from Robin Wall Kidner. I love how she talks about how her brain works and how she sees the world. And that just brings me so much delight. Indigenous Peoples' History of the United States.
Oh, yeah. That's
is another really good one from Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz. And then I think you and I in our last conversation talked a little bit about Billionaire Wilderness from Justin Farrell. And that was also, I really felt myself seen in that book, because I had a similar experience, except obviously not like a Yale professor that is invited into these homes, but more as the housekeeper, as the people, putting up the flowers for events, the person cleaning the homes, the person then eventually the person designing some of these homes. I got a little bit of the glimpse of that world. And so much of it just really resonated with my own lived experience living in, close to Aspen and the Vail community and seeing like some of that abundance of wealth. And it was, again, similar experience. Another book that I also really liked is Black Earth Wisdom by Leah Penniman. And that just really speaks about like the African-American experience to the connection to the land. So I really like to read Indigenous and Black and Latina writers and around conservation and how they connect to land. And then another really good one that I like as well is Emergent Strategy from Adrienne Marine Brown as well. I love her. She does a lot of metaphor with nature as well, but more as community organizing and network connection. That I really like to read how she uses metaphor in her thinking and in her writing around, how communities can organize themselves and how things develop and how you see the same patterns in the universe, all the way to microscope, all the way to how we are as people.
Oh man, that sounds good. I need to read that one. We'll have links to all those in the episode notes for people listening. And then last question, you've already given so much wisdom, and I'm telling you, you need to write a book and put it all in there. But any kind of final parting words for everybody that listens to this thing?
Well, thank you for inviting me. And, I think I just hope, your listeners just really hear this with, an open heart. I know a lot of people and their relationship with immigrations and others. And, it can be a complex conversation, but I really hope people, listen with their heart and can really hopefully help, dismantle some of these myths around, who is an immigrant? What does immigration have to do with conservation? And what is all of this? How is all of this connected? So I really hope people have the opportunity to be expansive in their imagining of how we're having these conversations and hopefully breaking down some of those barriers that we have created in our mind that, we have to be separate people, that we can't work together, and that all of our issues are not interrelated.
I love it. You're so wise, and I want to hang out. We got to hang out in person because you're just an amazing person. You got an amazing story, and your ability to talk about these very complex issues in a way that's engaging and understandable and can move the needle it's really, really cool to talk with you. And I know you got a lot going on. So thank you for taking the time.
Absolutely. And let me know whenever you're in the Roaring Fork Valley. I don't know how often you come to this little part of the woods, but as you might know, we have some of the best BLM land, and Colorado Parks and Wildlife also has a lot of amazing areas. So, let me know when you're out here, and I'm happy to connect. And then also, share you some of the little secrets.
That'd be awesome.
Some of the best places that don't have tons of tourists, and you can still have a little bit of solace.
Hey, it's Ed again. Thanks so much for listening to the podcast. I know your time is valuable, so it means the world that you spend it listening. If you want to support the podcast and help it to continue to spread and grow, there are a few ways you can help. Number one, pass it along to a friend or share it on social media. Word of mouth recommendations are the most powerful way for ideas to spread, so I'd love it if you could share the podcast with a few pals who might enjoy it. Number two, you can go to Apple Podcasts and give it a 5-star review. Good reviews encourage the Apple overlords to suggest the podcast to others. So there's a link in the notes if you'd be so kind as to give it 5 stars. Number three, you can support the podcast financially via Patreon, and there are exclusive benefits for those who do, including a monthly behind-the-scenes newsletter, Mountain and Prairie stickers, live and recorded video chats with podcast guests, and much more. Number four, I've also got 2 emails that I send out. The first is my weekly email called Good News from the American West, which I send out every Wednesday. It's only positive news, something we can all use a little more of these days. And my other email is my bi-monthly book recommendations email. One email every other month with 5, 6, 7, or 8 books that I've recently read and highly recommend. The thousands of people on both of these lists will vouch for me. No spam or other funny business. And number 5, finally, check out my online store for Mountain and Prairie stickers, shirts, and coffee mugs. I've got some really cool designs from Western artists with more on the way. So head to mountainandprairie.com/shop to check it all out. I'd love to connect with you. I'm on Instagram and LinkedIn, so look me up on either of those platforms by my name or through the links on my website. All right, that's it. Thanks so much for your support.